My grandmother rewrote her will every single year for 29 years. 29 years. And nobody in my family knew. The day we finally found out, 11 of us were sitting around a lawyer's table in Columbus, Ohio. Aunts, uncles, cousins, my mother, my father, and me. I was 26 years old, wearing the only blazer I owned. The lawyer opened the envelope, cleared his throat, and started reading. By the time he finished, 2 people at that table were crying. 3 were furious. And 1 had already pulled out their phone to call their own attorney. My mother, quiet, steady, never asked for anything. Sandra had just inherited a $2.1 million farm. Because of one word. One single word that my grandmother changed. Alone. 5 months before she died. And when you hear why she changed it, when you hear what she had been watching for 29 years, I think it is going to stay with you for a long time. Hit like, subscribe, and drop your city and local time in the comments. Okay. Let me take you back to 1965. To a town called Millbrook, about 40 minutes southeast of Columbus, Ohio. Population, maybe 3,000 people. A grain elevator. 2 churches. And a diner called Patsy's that everyone in town had an opinion about. That was where Rupert James Calloway and Dorothy Mae Hutchins got married. A Saturday afternoon in June. In the backyard of her parents' property. Rupert was 24. Dorothy was 22. He was working at the grain elevator and had already saved enough to put a down payment on 80 acres of farmland just outside of town. She was working at the school district as a secretary. People who knew them back then always said the same thing. Rupert was quiet, steady, and almost impossible to read. Dorothy was the opposite. Warm. Loud. Generous. The kind of woman who remembered every birthday and sent cards for every occasion. You would think they were complete opposites. And in some ways they were. But they had something between them that was hard to describe unless you had seen it with your own eyes. A private language. The way he always put his hand on the small of her back when they walked into a room. The way she laughed at things he said that nobody else found funny. They built their life on that farm slowly. Year by year. They added on to the house twice. They had 5 children. Carol, in 1967. My mother Sandra, in 1969. Raymond, in 1971. Then twin boys, Gary and Dennis, in 1975. Now I want you to understand that farm before we go any further. Because the farm is what this story is actually about. Not in the way you might think. It was not about the money, though there was money, eventually. It was about what the farm meant. To Rupert, it meant everything he had built with his own hands. To Dorothy, it meant the place where her children were raised. Where her grandchildren ran barefoot in summers. Where she grew tomatoes and canned them every August. To everyone else? Well, that is where things get complicated. My grandfather expanded the farm over the years. By the time I was born in 1993, it was 212 acres. He had diversified into soybean and corn leasing agreements with a larger agricultural operation, pulling in somewhere between $180,000 and $220,000 a year in lease income. By the early 2000s, the land alone was appraised at somewhere between $1.4 and $1.7 million. That is a lot of money for a town like Millbrook. It is a lot of money anywhere. And there were 5 children who all knew it was there. Let me introduce you to those 5 children. Because you need to know who they are. Carol was the oldest. She had moved to Cincinnati in her 20s and married a man named Phil Drucker who worked in insurance. Carol was the kind of person who had strong opinions about everything and was not shy about sharing them. She called my grandmother every Sunday. Which sounds sweet. Until you understand that those calls were usually 45 minutes of Carol explaining why everyone else in the family was doing something wrong. She had 3 kids of her own, Tyler, Brianna, and a youngest named Marcus. My mother Sandra was the second born. The one who stayed closest to Millbrook. She had married my father, David Park, who was Korean American, had come to Ohio for college, and somehow never left. He worked as a systems analyst for a manufacturing company out of Columbus. My mother did bookkeeping for small businesses in the area. They lived about 20 minutes from the farm. I am their only child. Then there was Raymond. Raymond was the one who had never quite figured out what he wanted to do with his life. Which would have been fine, if he had not spent 3 decades asking Rupert and Dorothy to help fund the figuring out process. 2 failed businesses. A car detailing operation in 1998. A landscaping company in 2004. Both quietly backed by my grandparents with loans that were never fully repaid. Raymond meant well. He genuinely did. But he had a soft spot for ideas that sounded good over the kitchen table at Thanksgiving and fell apart in reality. Gary was the first of the twin boys. He had gone into real estate, done quite well for himself in the Columbus suburbs, and had that particular energy of someone who had made money young and needed everyone around him to know it. He drove a black Cadillac Escalade. Wore a gold watch he mentioned 3 times in any given conversation. And had opinions about the farm that he shared primarily in terms of what it was worth per acre. His wife Lynette was similar. They had 2 kids, Paige and Colton. Dennis was the second twin, and honestly, the one I knew the least. He had moved to Phoenix, Arizona in his 30s, remarried after a divorce, and came back to Ohio about twice a year. He was pleasant enough. A little distant. The kind of uncle who called on your birthday but you would not recognize his voice until he said his name. He worked in IT consulting. His second wife was named Renata. So. 5 children. Very different lives. Very different relationships with Rupert and Dorothy. My grandmother told me the story of the first will herself, about a year before she died. We were sitting on her back porch. In those old green plastic chairs that had been there since the early 90s. Drinking sweet tea. Watching the light change over the fields. She told me things that afternoon that I do not think she had ever told anyone else in exactly the same way. She said that in 1990, when my grandfather was 50 years old and the farm had become genuinely valuable, Rupert decided it was time to be responsible. He scheduled a meeting with a lawyer in Columbus, Gerald Watts, the same man who would be sitting across from us 29 years later, and they had a will drafted. The original will was straightforward. The farm and all assets would pass to Dorothy if Rupert died first. If they died at the same time. Or if Dorothy predeceased him, the assets would be split equally, 5 ways, among the children. Simple. Clean. Logical. That lasted exactly 1 year. In 1991, something happened at Christmas that my grandmother described to me simply as a conversation that went too far. She did not give me every detail. She said some things were between her and Rupert. But what I understood was this. One of the children had said something at the Christmas dinner table about the farm. About what they expected to receive when the time came. About how they had been counting on a certain amount. Rupert sat quietly through the whole thing. Which was his way. But that Monday morning, he called Gerald Watts. And the will was rewritten. She did not tell me what changed in that first revision. She just smiled at her sweet tea and said, "Your grandfather had a long memory. Here is what I have been able to piece together. From conversations over the years. From what my mother remembered. From what Gerald Watts confirmed after the reading. And from documents we were eventually allowed to examine. Every single year, from 1991 to 2019, Rupert and Dorothy Calloway sat down with Gerald Watts and reviewed their will. Sometimes they changed nothing of substance. Sometimes they made small adjustments. Sometimes, after a particular fight, a particular slight, a particular act of kindness or cruelty, they made changes that would have mattered enormously if anyone had known. But nobody knew. That was the point. Gerald Watts told us, in that conference room, that in his 41 years of practicing estate law, he had never had clients who were so deliberate, so consistent, and so private about the process. He said that Rupert in particular was almost methodical. He would come in every January. Usually alone. Sometimes with Dorothy. He would say, "Let us review." And they would go through the document line by line. Some years, the changes were small. A name corrected. An address updated. A clause adjusted for tax purposes. Some years, the changes were significant. I want to pause here and be honest with you about something. I am telling you this story as I experienced it. Which means I did not know most of this while it was happening. My whole childhood. My whole young adulthood. I had no idea that my grandparents were running this quiet, private audit of their family every single year. I thought the will was the will. I assumed it was that original 1990 document, sitting in a filing cabinet somewhere, collecting dust. A lot of us assume that. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever found out, after the fact, that someone in your family was quietly watching everything? Keeping score. Making decisions. Deciding who was really showing up, and who was just showing up when it was convenient. Drop a comment if that hit close to home. And tell me, did finding out change how you felt about them? I really want to know. And one farm, while the will was being rewritten every year in the privacy of Gerald Watts's conference room, life in the Calloway family was continuing the way life always does. Messily. Imperfectly. With moments of genuine love and moments of genuine ugliness. Let me tell you about some of those moments. Because they matter. In 1994, Raymond came to Rupert and asked for $22,000 to fund his car detailing business. Rupert gave it to him. He told Raymond it was a gift. In private, he told Dorothy it was a loan, and he wanted it recorded. When the business folded 4 years later, Rupert never said a word about the money. But Dorothy told me he marked it in a notebook he kept in his desk drawer. A composition notebook. Black and white marbled cover. The kind you get at a drugstore for 99 cents. Every significant financial transaction with each child, written in that notebook. In 1997, Carol and Phil came to visit and spent most of the weekend walking the property with a realtor friend of Phil's that they had apparently invited without asking. My grandparents came home from church on Sunday morning to find this man measuring the front pasture. Rupert, who almost never raised his voice, walked over, shook the man's hand politely, and said, "You can see yourself out." He did not speak directly to Carol for the rest of the weekend. He called Gerald Watts that Tuesday. In 1999, Gary made a comment at Easter dinner about how the farm was an underperforming asset. He said Rupert should consider selling and putting the proceeds into a real estate investment trust that Gary would help manage. He had printed out a prospectus. He brought it to Easter dinner. My grandmother said that Rupert took the prospectus, folded it carefully in half, put it in his back pocket, and never mentioned it again. Gary thought that meant his father was considering it. He was not. In 2001, my mother Sandra drove my grandfather to his first cardiology appointment after his doctor found an irregular heartbeat. She took the day off work. She sat with Dorothy in the waiting room for 3 hours. She brought food from Patsy's diner for both of them, because she knew my grandmother had not eaten since breakfast. Nobody asked her to do any of this. She just did it. In 2004, Raymond's landscaping business needed $31,000. Again, Rupert helped. Again, it went into the notebook. In 2007, Dennis called from Phoenix to say he was thinking about moving back to Ohio. And wanted to know if there was any arrangement that could be made for him to build a house on the back portion of the farm property. Rupert said he would think about it. He thought about it for approximately 3 weeks. Then he called Dennis to say the farm was a working operation and not a subdivision. Dennis did not call for 6 months afterward. In 2009, my grandmother had a small stroke. Not debilitating, but enough to change things. She was in the hospital for 5 days. My mother was there every single day. Carol drove up from Cincinnati on day 2, stayed for 1 night, and had to, quote, get back for Tyler's soccer tournament. Gary and Lynette sent flowers. Dennis called from Phoenix. My grandmother recovered well. But something shifted in her after that. She got quieter in a different way. More observant. More deliberate. She told me once, a few years before she died, that the stroke had given her a kind of clarity. She said, when you think you might be leaving, you start to see very clearly who came to the door and who sent flowers. I need to tell you about my own relationship with my grandparents. Because I am the narrator of this story, and you deserve to know where I stood. I grew up 20 minutes from that farm. That was not an accident. My mother had chosen to stay close, and she had made sure I grew up knowing my grandparents as real people, not just holiday dinner relatives. From the time I was small, I was at that farm constantly. Summer mornings walking the fence lines with Rupert while he checked for damage. Afternoons in the kitchen with Dorothy, learning to make her pie crust, which involved a technique with cold butter and ice water that I have never seen in any cookbook. Saturday nights watching old westerns with Rupert, who could not stand modern action movies because, he said, nobody takes a breath. As I got older, that relationship deepened into something more like friendship. I was not just a grandchild visiting out of obligation. I came because I wanted to be there. In high school, I drove out on weeknights sometimes just to have dinner with them. In college, I called my grandmother every week. Not always long calls. Sometimes just 10 minutes. After college, when I was figuring out my own life and feeling uncertain about everything, it was that farmhouse kitchen where I felt most like myself. I also helped with things. When my grandfather's back made it hard to do certain tasks around the property, I was the one who showed up on Saturdays. When my grandmother's eyesight started to go, I was the one who drove her to appointments, helped her read her mail, set up large print settings on the tablet my mother bought her. I am not telling you this to make myself sound good. I am telling you because it is relevant to what happened in that conference room. And because I want to be honest. I did not do those things for any calculation. I did them because I loved those 2 people in a way that I am not sure I have ever fully put into words. Rupert was not a demonstrative man. He did not say I love you easily or often. But there were things he did. Every time I left the farm, he walked me to my car. Every single time. No matter the weather. No matter how tired he was. He would stand by my driver's side door and he would say, "You be careful." And the way he said it, it was not a dismissal. It was everything. Dorothy was the one who talked. The one who asked questions and remembered the answers. The one who noticed when something was off and sat across from you at the kitchen table and waited until you were ready to say it out loud. I miss them both every single day. By 2015, the dynamics in the family had become, as my mother would put it, complicated. That was her word for situations that had more conflict than she was comfortable naming directly. Carol had retired and was spending more time visiting the farm. But visiting had a specific flavor to it. It involved a lot of conversations with Rupert about financial management. About whether he had updated his portfolio. About whether he had spoken to a financial advisor recently. She brought her son Tyler along on several of these visits. Tyler, who worked in finance in Cincinnati, would sit at my grandfather's kitchen table with a legal pad and ask questions about asset allocation. Rupert would answer pleasantly, offer them coffee, and then do nothing they suggested. He was a patient man. Gary and Lynette came up from Columbus more frequently too. They had started talking about the farm in a way that made my mother uncomfortable. Using phrases like, "when we have the property," "what we plan to do with the acreage." They had not inherited anything yet. They were talking about plans that assumed they would. In 2016, Gary pulled my mother aside at a family dinner and told her that he and Carol had discussed it, and they thought the most logical approach was for the farm to be sold after their parents were gone, proceeds split 5 ways, and that they hoped she was on board with that plan. My mother said she did not know what she was or was not on board with, because it was not her decision to make. Gary looked at her like she had said something strange. What nobody knew, what I did not know until that conference room, was that in 2016, Rupert and Dorothy had met with Gerald Watts in January, as they did every January. And the will had been revised again. In 2017, my grandfather's health began declining more seriously. He was 81 years old. The irregular heartbeat, managed with medication. Arthritis that made walking painful. Some memory difficulties, not severe, but noticeable. My mother increased her visits to the farm. I came out more. We made sure someone was always checking in. That same year, Carol began pushing for a family meeting about planning for the future. She used that phrase, planning for the future, in a way that meant something very specific. Which was planning for the distribution of assets. Rupert agreed to the meeting. It happened in September 2017, in the farmhouse living room. All 5 children present. Spouses. Me. Rupert sat in his chair, the recliner by the window, the one he had sat in for 20 years. He let Carol run the meeting, which she did efficiently, with a printed agenda. She had brought a printed agenda to a meeting at her parents' farmhouse. It covered appraisal of the property, potential sale timelines, a proposal to establish a family LLC, and what she called equitable distribution considerations. My grandfather listened to all of it. He nodded at intervals. When Carol finished, he said, "I appreciate you putting all that together." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dorothy and I will let you know what we decide." And that was the end of the meeting. Carol tried to keep it going for another 20 minutes. But Rupert had said what he was going to say. The meeting was over. Carol called my mother that night. Furious. She said Rupert was being stubborn. Said he was not being realistic about the future. Said someone needed to get through to him. My mother said, "He heard you, Carol. He just doesn't agree." Rupert Calloway died in April 2018. 83 years old. A Tuesday morning. In the farmhouse. He had declined quickly over the preceding 3 months, in that way that very old people sometimes do. A series of small surrenders until there are no more to give. My mother was with him. I was there. Dorothy held his hand. The family gathered for the funeral. It was a proper small-town Ohio funeral, the kind with casseroles and church ladies and the neighbor who had known Rupert for 50 years standing in the receiving line with red eyes. He was buried in the Millbrook Cemetery, next to the grave that already had his name on one side of the stone. After the funeral, there was a brief, quiet conversation about the will. Gerald Watts had already been in contact. He said that under the terms of Rupert's will, everything passed to Dorothy as the surviving spouse. The farm. The accounts. Everything. This was not a surprise. That had been the structure from the beginning. The larger questions would come when Dorothy was gone. Carol pushed Gerald for a preview. She asked if he could tell them generally what Dorothy's will said, so the family could plan appropriately. Gerald told her that Dorothy's will was Dorothy's private document and he was not in a position to share it. Carol was not happy about this. Dorothy lived another 14 months after Rupert. They were quiet months, in most ways. She stayed on the farm. She refused to leave it. Refused to move to assisted living. Refused any suggestion that she might be better off somewhere else. My mother organized a rotation of care. I came out several times a week. A home health aide named Patricia came in every morning. Dorothy was sharp, mostly. She had good days and slower days. On the good days she was fully herself, funny, direct, interested in everything. On the slower days she sat on the back porch and looked at the fields and did not want to talk much. She and I had several conversations in those months that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. One afternoon in February 2019, about 5 months before she died, she brought me inside and sat me down at the kitchen table. The same table where I had eaten approximately 1,000 meals. She said she wanted to talk about some things. She told me about the will. Not the contents, but the practice. She told me that she and Rupert had rewritten it every year because they believed that families change, circumstances change, people show you who they are over time. And a document you write once at 50 years old should not be the final word at 83. She said that Rupert believed, deeply believed, that inheritance should reflect reality, not expectation. She said, "Your grandfather watched this family very carefully for a very long time." I asked her if she could tell me anything about what the will said. She smiled and said, "You will find out when it is time." She died in June 2019. I was there. My mother was there. Patricia was there. I need to take a breath here. And I want to check in with you. Does this story feel familiar in any way? Not necessarily the farm or the money, but the feeling of watching a family split along invisible fault lines, while two quiet people at the center of it just kept watching. Comment below. And if you are still here and have not subscribed yet, please do. These stories take everything I have to tell. And it means the world that you are listening. Gerald cleared his throat. And he read. To my children and grandchildren. I hope you will hear this in the spirit it is intended. Which is love. Even when love is honest. Your father and I rewrote our will every year for 29 years because we believed that a family is not a fixed thing. People change. Relationships change. Some people show up and some people do not. And we thought it was right to pay attention to that over time, rather than make a single decision in a single moment. We have been watching our family carefully for a very long time. We have watched who called and who came. Who came when it was easy, and who came when it was hard. We have watched who saw us as people, and who saw us as an asset. We have watched who asked what we needed, and who told us what they planned to do with what we had built. We made our decisions slowly and carefully. The same way we made every decision in our lives. Sandra has been a daughter to us in every sense of the word. She was not the only one who loved us. And we know that. But she was the one who loved us in a way that did not ask for anything in return. She brought food when there was no one to see her bring it. She sat in waiting rooms. She came on Tuesday afternoons when nothing was happening, when there was nothing to gain, when she simply came because she wanted to be with us. The farm is the thing we built together. We wanted to go to someone who will care for it the way we cared for it, not as an asset to be liquidated, but as a piece of something real. To our other children, we love you. We hope you can understand, even if it is hard right now. We hope the years will make it make sense. And to our grandchildren, all of you. Please be the kind of people who show up. Not for what you will get. Just show up. It matters more than you know. Dorothy Mae Calloway, January 14, 2019 inch. Gerald folded the letter and placed it on the table. My mother was crying. My father had his hand over hers. I was trying very hard to hold it together and not succeeding particularly well. Carol stood up. She said she would be speaking to her own attorney. Gerald said she was welcome to. She said this was undue influence, that someone had manipulated their parents. Gerald said, with the same practiced patience, that Dorothy and Rupert had made these decisions annually, consistently, in his presence, and that he was prepared to attest to their full competency at every meeting, including the final one in January 2019. Gary said. Sandra had access to them. She had access that the rest of us didn't. My mother looked at Gary for a long moment. She said, very quietly, I had access because I showed up, Gary. The room was quiet. Now I have to tell you about the one word. After the meeting, after Carol and Gary and their families had left, Gerald asked my mother and father and me to stay. He said there was something else he wanted to share. Something that was not part of the legal reading but that he felt, in good conscience, the family should know. He said that in reviewing the 29 versions of the will, there was something notable about the final revision. The one made in January 2019. 5 months before Dorothy died. He said that in 28 of those 29 versions, the primary beneficiary of the farm and property had been listed the same way. The language had evolved slightly over the years, as legal conventions changed, but the essential designation had read, in various formulations. To my children, in equal shares. In the final version, that phrase had been changed to read. To my daughter Sandra. One word. Children became Sandra. 28 revisions over 28 years, and the farm had always been heading, at least on paper, toward all 5 equally. Right up until that final January meeting. Gerald said he did not know exactly what had prompted the change. He said that Dorothy had come in alone that January. Rupert had been gone for 8 months. She had been clear-eyed and certain. She made one change. Reviewed the rest of the document. And signed it. He said he had asked her, as he always did. "Are you sure?" She said. "I have been thinking about this for 50 years. I am sure. I think about that a lot. I think about Dorothy sitting across from Gerald Watts in January. A widow of 8 months. 80 years old. Having been through a stroke a decade before. Having outlived the man she had walked every fence line and every season with. Sitting across from that table. And making, with complete clarity, one final choice. She did not change very much. She had been watching for 29 years and the conclusion she arrived at was not a dramatic reinvention. It was a small, deliberate word. One word. I have to ask you something. And I want you to really think about it before you answer in the comments. Do you think Dorothy made the right call? I am not asking whether you think it was fair. I am asking whether you think she made the right call. Those are different questions. Tell me what you think. And tell me, are you someone who shows up, or someone who sends flowers? Because I think most of us know, if we are honest with ourselves, which one we are. Carol did hire an attorney. The challenge lasted about 6 months. It went nowhere. Gerald Watts had 29 years of documented, witnessed revisions, all showing consistent competency and deliberate decision-making. Dorothy's doctor provided a statement confirming she had been fully competent at the time of the final revision. The challenge was dropped. Gary did not speak to my mother for about 2 years. It was not an official estrangement, there was no dramatic declaration. He simply stopped calling. And stopped returning calls. Lynette sent a Christmas card in 2020 that my mother described as chilly. In 2021, at a cousin's wedding in Toledo, Gary and my mother ended up sitting near each other at the rehearsal dinner. My mother described it as a civil conversation. Things have been slowly, awkwardly thawing since then. He came to a family dinner at Thanksgiving 2023. It was not easy. But he came. Raymond, and this surprised everyone, I think, including himself. Took the forgiveness of his debt quietly and gracefully. He called my mother the day after the reading and said, "I know what Mom and Dad saw. I know why." That was all he said about it. He has spent the last several years sober, working steadily, with a better relationship with his own kids than he has had in decades. Somehow, the conclusion of that era in his life, the era of asking and failing, set him free. Dennis was distant but not hostile. He called my mother from Phoenix. He said the farm always felt like it belonged to her more than to any of them, and that he could not pretend otherwise. It was one of the more generous things anyone said in that entire period. Carol has been the most complicated. She and my mother have a relationship that I would describe as formal. They see each other at family gatherings. They are polite. There are no open wounds visible on the surface. But there is a scar there. I think there always will be. My mother and father have kept the farm. They have not sold it. They will not sell it for 15 years, per the terms of the will. But I do not think they would sell it even after that. My mother has expanded the vegetable garden Dorothy always kept. My father has learned more about the lease operations than he ever expected to. They spend weekends there most of the year. My grandmother's green plastic chairs are still on the back porch. I go out there when I need to think. I make the pie crust the way Dorothy showed me, cold butter, ice water, work it fast so the heat of your hands doesn't get into it. I sit in those chairs. I look at the fields. And I think about two people who watched their family carefully for 50 years and tried to get it right. I think they did. Here is what I have been sitting with since all of this happened. We talk about inheritance like it is about money. And it is, partly. The money is real, and it matters. But what my grandparents were really doing, in those annual visits to Gerald Watts, was something more than financial planning. They were paying attention. They were saying, every year, that what people do matters. Not what people say at Easter dinner. Not what people put in a Christmas card. What they actually do. When there is no audience. When there is nothing to gain. When it is a Tuesday afternoon in February and the drive is 40 minutes each way and the person you are going to see is just going to offer you sweet tea and sit with you in a house that smells like old wood and tomatoes. That is what they were tracking. Not loyalty in some grand, dramatic sense. Just showing up. Dorothy wrote it in the letter, and I have thought about that phrase almost every day since Gerald read it aloud in that conference room. She came on Tuesday afternoons when nothing was happening, when there was nothing to gain. I think that is the whole thing. I think that is the whole lesson. And it applies way beyond inheritance and farms and contested wills. It applies to every relationship in your life, friendships, marriages, children, parents. The people who will be there for you are not always the people who make the biggest gestures. They are usually the people who showed up quietly, consistently, when there was nothing in it for them except the relationship itself. And I deeply believe, that the people around you are paying more attention to that than you realize. Rupert kept a composition notebook in his desk drawer. He wrote things down. He watched. Most people are watching, in their own ways. And most people know, even if they never say it out loud, who showed up and who sent flowers. My question for you, and I want you to really sit with this one. If the most important person in your life were quietly paying attention to everything you have done over the last year, what would they see? Not what you intended to do. Not what you meant to do. What you actually did. I ask myself that question a lot now. And it has changed some things about how I live. If this story meant something to you, please leave a comment. Tell me what landed. Tell me your own story, if you have one. I read every single comment, even when I cannot respond to all of them, and I am always grateful that you are here. If you are not subscribed yet, please do it now. There are more stories coming. Honest, specific, complicated stories about families and money and love and what people do when the stakes are real. This channel exists because of you. And I mean that. Take care of yourselves out there. And show up for the people who matter. Even on Tuesdays. Especially on Tuesdays.